I welcome you all to the world of spices. Tonight, Rabbi Fellman's going to teach us a little bit about the history of the spice trade. And then next week, we will hear from Ori, who's the owner of Burlap and Barrel, and he will tell us about the modern spice trade. And then we have 2 weeks in the kitchen where we will actually get to smell and taste all of Burlap and Barrel's spices. So on that note, I'm going to stop talking, put myself on mute, and it's all yours, Rabbi Fellman.
So first of all, I just want to let you know, Carolyn Schwartz just walked in and she is sitting in my office listening to this whole thing. She's accompanied by an old man who looks familiar. So Carolyn and Frank are here. So I can turn the screen around and you can see them. Hold on a second. They say they know what they look like, but just in case anybody else wants to see them, there they are. And if you look behind them, you'll see a big table filled with books. Today's one of my favorite days of the year. The Jewish Book Council is a program that we've just joined. I've been connected with them for years. And today's the day that their books arrived. So I have a table filled with all new Jewish books just published this year. Many of them will end up in our library. Some of them will end up on a table that says free for the taking outside the office. And we are hopefully going to be able to invite some of the speakers, the writers of the books, to speak about them. And in fact, there is a book over there about the spice trade, and I'm trying to remember what it's called. You don't need to go look for it, Frank. We'll look for it later. And I'll flash the book up for you if I remember later tonight. Otherwise, we'll do it next week. But there are all sorts of interesting things written about the spice trade. And so that's a cool thing that is coming up for our congregation in the coming months. There are also a couple of really fun cookbooks that are there this year that I'm happy to share with you. If you stop by the office and you want to peruse the books, feel free. If I'm not in the office, that's fine. You can still walk in and look. Just don't take any of the books right now. There will come a point where we can loan them out a little bit, but now is not yet that time. So if you happen to be in the building and you want to take a peek, feel free. And if there's a book that you're interested in, just write down a note to me and tell me. And as soon as we're available to loan them out, I will happily do that. But for right now, we're going to a conference in a couple of weeks where we're going to meet all the authors. And so I want to keep all the books together for the time being. All that being said, let me share the screen. How many of you have this at home? You guys have that at home?
Mm-hmm.
How many of you know the story of Old Bay seasoning? Hold on a second. I got to get out of this screen to be able to see it. Raise your hands again if you know the story. So Susan knows a little bit. Lynn knows a little bit. So Old Bay has a really fun story. Old Bay, what's Old Bay seasoning used for primarily? What was it created for?
Seafood.
Right, crab. And I have no idea if it tastes good on crab because I'm not a crab connoisseur. Surprise, surprise.
No, it is.
That Lynn is the crabby one among us. How
Yes, I am. Only kosher crabs.
They're very hard to find except in Maryland. The story of Old Bay seasoning is really a fascinating story, and it tells much actually about the Jewish connection with the spice trade. And so I thought I would begin with that. This is actually the pictures from an article, and I can happily send you the article link if you want. Old Bay was created by a German Jewish man who barely got out of the Holocaust, actually spent 2 weeks in Buchenwald. He was living in Germany. He had a thriving spice business going, doing well. Kristallnacht came along. His building, his office was, or his business rather, was taken away from him. His employees left him, and he was shortly thereafter arrested and sent off to Buchenwald. Somehow or another, he was freed after only 2 weeks. The stories I've read indicate that somebody paid off the Gestapo to pull him out. I don't know how many people actually were able to pull that kind of deal and get out. Nonetheless, he got out, and his family, he went back to his family in, I want to say Frankfurt, but I'm not positive. And they very quickly migrated to the United States.
It is important. You can only watch it now.
He came to Baltimore where he settled, and in Baltimore, he wanted to go to work for the McCormick's spice company, and he went to work for them initially. They then found out he was Jewish and fired him on the spot. And he said, well, okay, and tried to figure out what to do. And he opened up his own spice trade across the street. And it started out as a little nothing kind of a spice trade, but he was near where the longshoremen would come in with a catch every day, and they would ask for seasonings for this or that or the other. And he sort of started creating different things. When he put Old Bay together, it was actually just sort of a random mixture. There was no real logic to it. It includes things like cinnamon, which is not exactly a spice you would think to use with shellfish at all. And it has cloves in it as well. Has something like 18 different spices mixed in. And he, at first it didn't really take off. Over time it took off, and it started to grow based on salt and pepper and garlic, and then all these other things added in. Next thing he knew, his business was booming, and he was selling Old Bay every which way, and Old Bay became a very well-known brand. McCormick tried to buy it back, tried to buy it from him, and he said no. Years later, after he died in the mid-late 80s, and about 5 years after he died, the family sold the business to McCormick for something like $12-13 million. So in the end, he came out just fine, and the business came out just fine. But it's this wonderful story of how he persevered. What does it actually have to say about the spice trade is a whole separate thing. One, the spice trade was a trade that traveled. One could deal in spices in Germany or in the United States or any other country in the world, and you could carry the profession with you. Two, it requires a level of creativity and a level of chutzpah. The creativity it requires is to understand how different flavors come together and understand cultures and how cultures play with flavors. The chutzpah is putting together new mixtures that people wouldn't think of. And both are important. A third is it helps to have the luck of history on your side. In this man's case, history initially was not smiling on him at all, but in time it worked. Geography also helps. At first, Germany was a wonderful place to do business. It turned into not being such a wonderful place. The United States, on the other hand, did turn out to be that. And so there are all sorts of different factors that come into play. To start talking about the spice trade, there are sort of 5 core factors that come into play. One is the role of history. One is the role of geography. One is economics. One is culture. And one is agriculture. The sale of almost any other widget, any other item, doesn't quite have all 5 of those factors playing into it. The spice trade is unique in this regard. The horse trade has been going on for centuries. But trading horses is about training an animal. And there's a little bit of blacksmithing in terms of horseshoes, that sort of thing, but it's training an animal. It doesn't deal with history. It deals with geography a little bit, and then you got to have territory that's welcoming to horses, but you're not dealing with culture and with agriculture to the same degree. Being in the building trades don't quite have that same mix. And so in a real way, the spice trade itself is based on a fascinating mix of these 5 elements that come together. So it's not just one spice, but rather combine the 5 spices of history, geography, economics, culture, and agriculture, and together you create the spice trade. So let's start with the history part and go way back in time, and then we'll work our way forward. So Marco Polo travels from Europe to China in pursuit of spice. Anybody know when that happened? Frank, it's before you were born. 1500s. He was there earlier than 1500s, 1200s. So Marco Polo is there in the 1200s. The spice trade, though, goes way back long before that, and the Jewish involvement in the spice trade. There was a very well-known spice trader in the 600s. Anybody know who it was? wasn't Jewish, but he was very well known and played a profound influence. A certain gentleman named Muhammad, the great prophet Muhammad of the Muslim world, Muhammad was a spice trader. Go back even further, and you've got spice traders going back millennia. And so the idea of the role of spice goes back historically a long time, because as humans, as we consume food, we get bored pretty easily. And so we want flavor changes. So the world that we're living in gives us one set of flavors, but we've never been terribly patient about living with just that set of flavors. So if you were in the Middle East, for example, if you're in the land of Israel, olive oil was plentiful and was used a lot. But if you wanted some other flavor, you were willing to trade your olive oil to get something else. And so the notion of trading for flavors to increase, what happened at your kitchen table and increase your menu possibilities is something that goes way back in human history, long before Jews were ever on the scene. We're talking way, way, way back. The other interesting part of history is, and this brings in geography, is the history of where Jews lived plays into the role of Jews in the spice trade. So Israel sits at the axis of 3 different continents. To the north is Europe, to the south is Africa, and to the east is Asia. Israel also happens to sit on the axis of 2 or 3 major intersections of ancient highways. Now, by highways here, I don't mean the Pennsylvania Turnpike, but I do mean well-traveled routes, well-traveled paths. And long before there was Breezewood, the big interchange, there was the interchange between the King's Highway and the Negev Highway. The King's Highway went from Africa to Asia through the eastern side of the Jordan River, so what is today modern Jordan. And it still exists. There are historic landmark kind of signs. If you find yourself traveling from Petra to Amman, for example, you travel along the same path that was the King's Highway. And I mean, obviously it's paved now, it's modernized, but it's the same path that has been traveled and traversed for millennia. The path through the Negev started at the port of Jaffa, which is an ancient port, and traveled across Israel, across the Negev south, to meet up with the King's Highway in what is today suburban Aqaba, which is Eilat's sister city. So Eilat sits on the Red Sea, Aqaba is just over the Jordanian border, and the two of them effectively are twin cities. There was a time in the 90s when the two cities had a lot going back and forth, and there was talk of actually building an international airport on the border, literally over the border, because there was so much traffic from Europe coming down, and they thought they could become a big resort area. And the big resorts on the Israeli side built in extra floors to build in casinos and all sorts of activities long before it was legal. They left the floors unfinished in these hotels, figuring that this joint endeavor with the Arab world would open it up and would create all sorts of economic opportunity. As it happens, that has never quite emerged yet. I think the time will come when it does, but we're not there yet. So you have this great intersection, very much like Breezewood, actually, where you've got 2 big major routes intersecting with each other. That helps the space trade immensely. I should have noted at the beginning, if there are questions or comments along the way, by all means, stop me. You can put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask me a question, or raise your hand, or anything else. It's totally, totally fine. So the spice trade is native in many ways to the land of Israel. Here's another piece that makes it, so that brings Jews into it because it's geographically close. Another piece, spices are almost all, I mean, you'd be really hard pressed to find a spice that's not parve. So you don't have to worry about kashrut laws, which means that for a Jew, it's an easy business. And for people who are worried about dietary restrictions, it's a very welcoming trade because there's nothing holding them back. You can try every piece that you're selling, right? You can share every flavor and it all works. The only spices that have that problem are the ones that are now animal-based. But going way back in time, there weren't so many that were animal-based. These were much more plant-based. And so there is, because Jews had such focus on dietary laws, the spice trade was a welcoming profession. It was an easy glide in. So now we've got a little bit of history playing out. We've got a little bit of geography. We've got the history of Jews as, in terms of kashrut, playing in. Let's add in economics. Jews were traders, Traders. Jews were involved in all sorts of different trades. The markets in the cities were big open places with lots of business taking place. The ports, the port of Jaffa, the port of Haifa, these are old ancient ports that go way back in time. Haifa actually not, but Caesarea has an old port that was big in its day. Akko has a big port. The port of Jaffa was an enormous port. Jews were involved in all different kinds of international trade and international business. So the economics of this were such that it was easy to make deals because I can give you a little bit of this and you give me a little bit of that. The spice trade in particular was easy because it's easy to schlep your wares, right? Even if you're carrying significant amounts of the spices, you're not talking about heavy bags. Because in most cases, it's a tiny little bit of the spice that gives an enormous amount of flavor. And so for the ambitious trader, the spice trade is easy to take with you and easy to carry. And it's easy to set up so that you can barter with another or you can make a deal with another and you can make a living. For Jews who were looking to expand and move out of the confines of ancient Israel, that was all tempting. And so you've got the economics of this is an easy business to get into. It's easy to buy in a little bit to get some supply because you don't need to buy a lot of frankincense to be able to have a usable quantity. The tools of the trade are relatively easy. You need a reliable scale. You need some basic tools, but nothing terribly significant. And the economics are such that an aggressive, willing person who wants to get into the industry can do so. We'll come back to the culture part. Let me skip ahead to agriculture for a second. Spices are grown in different parts of the world. Somebody's asking me a question here. Hold on a second. Where did the traders acquire their spices? Okay, so Pat and Lynn asked the question, where did the traders acquire their spices? There were big open spice markets in all of these places. So the ports had spice markets. If you walk into the shuk today in Jerusalem, you'll see huge spice vendors, both in the Arab shuk in the old city and in the Jewish shuk in the new city. Both of them, big spice vendors with big piles of spice, far more quantity actually than they ever would have kept in ancient days. If you go to other countries in open markets, you'll see the same thing. I remember being in Morocco a few years ago and seeing the exact same thing. I remember being in Egypt when I was a student. So we're going back 20, 25 years, same thing. Open air markets were conducive. Spices needed covering because they were susceptible to water, but for half the year in the Middle East, there isn't rain, so it's not a problem. So it's easy to keep the spices steady there. And spices don't always attract other creatures. So you don't have to worry about insects and rodents and all of that to the degree that you would if you were, say, a baker. So it's a different set of circumstances that one has in front of them. And it could be that, you know, in Jaffa, you traded with this ship and got this spice, and then you traveled yourself and went to the next town and then traded for another thing. And so by the time you get to where you're going, you've got this interesting cacophony of spices that's a result of having encountered all of these different people, right? In effect, you're creating your own variation of Old Bay. And then you're going to say, try Lynn Rubinson's special chicken rub. It's the best. Here's why. Right? And if Lynn's good at PR, she's going to be able to convince you this is why you should try it. And if she's not good at PR, she's probably just going to beat you with her cane until you eat it anyway. Right? Just making sure Lynn's awake. Which finger was that? To grow and produce many of these things was easy to do in the Middle East. So there is a section of what is now Saudi Arabia that was, you couldn't grow much of anything except spices. Succulents actually come from that part of the world, because succulents need relatively little water and they need relatively little nutrients to produce the plants. And so much of what was traded were things that were grown relatively local. And so that became the environment, and the agricultural side of things played into the whole equation as well. So you've got the ability of being able to harvest locally and quickly get crops from the field to market. And to harvest spice is a relatively easy thing, because you're basically taking either a leaf or a plant and grinding it, right? There's not a whole lot of production necessary. Salt was relatively plentiful in and around the Dead Sea, still is. So none of this was difficult or distant. And it doesn't need the kind of water-heavy agriculture that grain products, for example, would need. Or that being a rancher and raising animals would need. It has, the requirements are much looser. So the result is the ancient Near East produces much of this and then can trade in it. So we have these 5 overlays of history, geography, economics, and agriculture. And now we've got to talk culture for a second. So why would Jews be attracted to all of this? What are the skills that you would need to make yourself successful in the spice trade? Lynn's writing here, what were the common spices in those days? Frank, what were the common spices in your youth? Salt clearly was a big one, going all the way back. Peppers, different kinds of peppers go way back. You've heard about frankincense and myrrh. Those go way back. Onions and garlic were grown agrarian and don't quite fit in here. But all sorts of other things, all sorts of seeds kinds of things do. Cinnamon, yep. Cinnamon for sure fits in. Trying to think what other ones. Turmeric, all the kinds of the colorful ones that you would see if you were to go to a spice shop today. All of those bright different colors, those are all ancient things. Hyssop, Mara writes in here, cardamom. Sugar was a different proposition. Jennifer wrote in sugar. Sugar is a big deal, but it's a much harder thing to produce. You've got to have sugar beets or sugar cane or something. It's a trickier thing to do. Parsley is relatively easy to grow and grows quickly, so that you can grow multiple crops of parsley over the course of 1 year. So that you can grow one crop of parsley in 6, 8, 10 weeks, harvest it, and then grow another crop. It moves along quickly. The cultural part of all of this is one of the really interesting sides of Jewish involvement. And that is the following. To be really effective as a spice trader, you've got to be able to communicate in a number of different languages and cultures, because you're trading with people from all over the place. And Jews historically have put great emphasis on the word, on the written word. And so Jews disproportionately had multilingual people. And Jews were willing to learn all of these languages, and they were willing to embrace, for lack of a better term, sort of a globalist economic perspective. Globalization is one of those things that Jews have embraced. And if you look over the last 100, 150 years, Jews are at the heart of globalization. And if you look in modern America at those who are anti-globalization, you'll see almost no Jews in that crowd. A few, a very small number, but very, very few. And the reason is that Jews have lived in and have had to work with people from all sorts of different walks of life and different cultures and different areas for millennia. This is nothing new for us, right? So, I mean, the first exile was to Babylon, give or take about 2,500 years ago, but that wasn't the first time Jews were off in a different part of the world. Abraham starts off in Ur and moves to Canaan, and then goes from Canaan to Egypt and then comes back up. But Abraham's grandson, Jacob, ends up down in Egypt again. And so this business of mingling between cultures is ingrained in our history. It's who we are. And so I was writing, and the Israelites in Egypt were supposed to smear their doorposts with blood from the lambs they slaughtered on the eve of the Exodus. It has long branches. Yeah, we're going way back, way back. And our own particular culture encourages us to integrate with the other. And if you read through Torah, I mean, even today in the Torah study class, we were talking about interacting with slaves who were Israelite slaves versus non-Israelite slaves. So there was interaction with people who weren't of us. Way back then, even in Torah times, there's interaction between Israelites and non-Israelites. So we were not isolationists. We never have been. And if you look back in the history of modern America, the isolationist crowd, which seems to pop up every couple of generations, almost never has Jews in it. In fact, on the contrary, more often than not, the isolationists also happen to be a little bit anti-Semitic. So there's this fascinating overlay where history plays in. We end up with a better understanding of our own unique culture because we've engaged with these other cultures. So the combination of being linguists and people who love words and being people who believe in interacting with others made the spice trade a very welcoming place for Jews. So the spice trade exists. Anybody been to Jordan? Has anybody been to Petra? Frank's been to Petra. Carol and Rick have been to Petra. What do you remember most about it? The treasury, right?
The treasury and with the long walk down through the canyon.
And at first it looks like you're not coming into anything, and then all of a sudden,
there it is. Yeah.
do you remember
when you're in the bottom, the trail that was the route that at least our guide said that the spice route people took, as well as the bandits?
Right. The spice trail runs right through Petra, right smack through it. And there's some argument that the buildings, like the treasury and some of the other buildings there, were spice markets. It's near impossible to prove it today, but that's the running thought. Do you guys remember who the people were who built Petra? Remember the name of the people who lived there?
That was before my time.
Yes.
It was before your time, yes. Well before your time. The Nabateans. And the Nabateans were themselves big traders. And the spice trade was a big deal there. From a Jewish standpoint, though today we recognize Petra as in the nation of Jordan, from a Jewish viewpoint, where Petra is located is Greater Israel. So Greater Israel isn't just from the river to the sea. It actually encompasses much of what is modern Israel and modern Jordan. And this comes to play when the tribes are coming out of Egypt and coming back into the land of Israel. One tribe wants to remain on the other side of the Jordan River. And the other tribes initially say, what are you doing? And they say, look, we'll be the shock troops. We'll be the ones to be the first line of defense. And they say, okay. If it wasn't reasonable to live there, they would have never said, okay. So Greater Israel expanded over this large area. When the Nabateans were building Petra, our ancestors, the Israelites, were already living in the land. And so the spice trade was already a vibrant and vital part of local economy and local commerce. The Nabateans and the Israelites, from what history seems to show, get along with each other pretty well, and have an interesting history together. So at the same time that there's all of this stuff regionally, the fact that they're at this great intersection comes into play. So the big spice of one of the big spices coming from the east, from India, is cumin and curry, right? This all the stuff that's used that we still taste today when we go to an Indian restaurant. Those things came in, and flavors from Africa went out, and so you end up with this wonderful conglomeration of different flavors all at once. There's a great book that's written. Let me go back to sharing the screen to share this book with you. So we started with Old Bay. This is a wonderful book that I had just finished reading, that Mara actually recommended. It's called Cumin, Camels, and Caravans, A Spice Odyssey. And I have a copy of it here as well. Hi, Molly, how are you? Do you know any Spice songs that you can sing to everybody? And not Spice Girls songs, just Spice songs. Molly May just walked in here. She's doing a choir thing here, and she's trying to sing Sugar and Spice and Everything Nice as a Spice song. I'm not sure that qualifies, but.
Wait. Summer breeze makes me feel fine, blowing through the jasmine in my mind.
Okay, that works. Jasmine counts. Nicely done.
Are you going to Scarborough Fair?
Parsley, sage, rosemary, and thyme. That's what I was expecting.
Really good at this game.
All right, so I highly recommend this book. It was checked out by Mara or Richard. I'm not sure which one. Gary Nabhan is the writer. It's checked out from the local library, so it's readily available. I'll be returning it soon. And the author here goes through. Look at the colors that jump at you. He goes through sort of the history of the spice trade. So what's the story that the spice trade tells? And he gets into the same things we've been talking about, the culture and the history. The other interesting piece here is this section, Jews and Arabs working together. The spice trade was one of those places where we interacted well with our neighbors. Jewish traders went all over the place, from Oman to India to China, 6 centuries before Marco Polo was there. And long before the internet, long before telegraph lines, Jewish traders could write a check in Portugal and it would be honored in China. There was, the traders knew each other and trusted because of what they were all doing. They were doing the same thing. There was trust within the business. And so even though there was competition, this spice trader wants to make the deal over that one, they all interacted with each other. And you know, if you put a group together of any group in the same business, you put a group of, I don't know, car salesmen or furniture salespeople, or give me another widget. I don't know what other clothing salespeople. Internally, they're going to likely get along. They're going to compete with each other and say, well, mine's better than yours, but they're going to get along with each other. The Arabs and the Jews got along well because they had similar things culturally. And nobody was trying to disabuse, nobody was trying to abuse the other one. Nobody was trying to, there was a sense of respecting the culture that came with the spice business itself, rather than the great American thing of how much can we dig up and take from them, there was the sense of recognizing and honoring the different cultures, which made the spice trade unique. And as a result, Arabs and Jews got along well with each other. Yes, there was also tension, as he talks about here. And Muhammad is a spice trader he also gets into. And then there's this wonderful piece that Reform Judaism published 3 years ago. I'm trying to remember when this was originally published. Is there a date on here? I don't see it. This piece talks about the spice trade in a really interesting way, and talks about the Sephardic role. And the Sephardic role of the spice trade is worth noting. Hold on one second. Scarborough Fair. And Mara writes in, Ori and his partner did a lot of work with the Palestinians. It's very interesting. There's a lot of interaction among Jews and Muslims within the spice trade even today.
Who is Ori?
Ori is, Mara, you want to talk about Ori for just a second?
Ori is the owner of Burlap and Barrel. So he was born in Israel, lives in the United States now, and they've just started carrying za'atar and another spice that they're getting from Palestinians, and they're supporting the Palestinian cookbook writer who just published a book, and they're very excited about it. So it's a very interesting thing. We don't tend to hear about that very often.
The interesting piece that Tina Wasserman's post, that her article mentions, is the role of Sephardi Jewry in the spice trade. And this is really worth noting. The Sephardi Jews integrated into a multiplicity of cultures in ways that the Ashkenazi world did not. The Ashkenazi world went to Northern Europe and to Central Europe and to Eastern Europe a little bit, but they didn't go, the Ashkenazi Jewry doesn't really quite get up to Scandinavia. It stays fairly centered in one area. Sephardi Jewry finds itself all over the Mediterranean. And each of those different nations around the Mediterranean have slightly different cultures, one from the next. And so the Sephardi world, while it's one whole, is made up of many different elements and different pieces. Spain, which was the head of it for many centuries, actually, had a particularly interesting role because of where it sat, because it had both Mediterranean access and Atlantic Ocean access. Morocco, frankly, had the same thing. Both countries had Jewish communities that were filled with travel, of people coming and going a lot. And both countries effectively had a whole bunch of forces at work at the same time. So if you go to Morocco, you'll learn about the Berbers and the Muslims and the French and all of these different groups coming together simply because of the geography of where Morocco sits. In Spain, you had the same thing. And Sephardic Jewry, which was more based in Spain than any particular other place, has all of these intersecting things going on at the same time. So you'd have a Sephardic Jew who lives in Spain but travels around the Mediterranean, interacting with all of these different people. And so the cultures blend together and the spices and the flavors blend together, which ends up with this really fascinating mix. So whereas Ashkenazi food is pretty much pick your favorite New York deli or your great-grandmother's kitchen table, Sephardi food is a much, much broader pool. It's a much broader and much more expansive palette. And Israel reflects that. I mean, Israel has definitely Ashkenazi pieces, but modern Israel even more so. If you walk into the spice markets and walk into some of the Sephardi restaurants that are popping up now, you find these really wonderful flavors and exotic tastes that come together. I know Temple Sinai has done lots of Israel trips. Have you guys done a foodie trip to Israel yet? All right, so it's a fun way to do Israel because you end up
Yeah,
picking.
no, Jamie did one.
Jamie?
Jamie did a foodie trip. The
It-
last one he did, I think, was a foodie trip.
So you end up picking up the culture and the history, all sorts of different elements by using food as the medium. You got to be willing to explore and try a few things. And if you have a stomach made out of steel, that's even better. But you end up with this really interesting way of understanding how Israel came to be and how Israel exists today, based on food and spices. So let me stop there now because I've been yapping for a long time here. What questions, what comments, what does this jar for you? What does this bring up for you?
I would be very interested in knowing or understanding or learning more about how they blended the spices. I think that would be fascinating.
So the blending game is asking an artist how the artist got the shades of the colors they got, which is a fascinating question to ask, but it's going to vary wildly. And each spice merchant had their own blends. And if you walk in today, if you go to the spice shops in the Shuk, they'll still do the same thing. And this one will tell you, oh, you have to try my zatar and my zatar blend on chicken when you make it because mine's better than the next one. And he might be right. Might be wrong too, depends on your palate. But there is
the last week that we do this, Hanita is going to work on spice blends. Everyone who comes is going to get 2 of Burlap and Barrel's spice blends, but we're also going to have spices there that you can sort of play with on your own and make your own spice blend. When Richard and I went to Morocco, you could buy the Moroccan spice with 12 spices, with 6 spices, with 36 spices. It all depended on how much taste you wanted.
and they would talk about layers of taste.
We did the same thing in this.
And Mara, you don't have smell-o-vision, so we in Watertown can't come,
No,
unfortunately.
we can't. You can't come to the last 2. You might have to come in for a week, and
Oh,
then you
yeah.
could, you could come on Wednesday, stay for a week, come and then leave.
I'll have to talk to Melissa about that.
Leon.
I'm going to be, for my cooking class, I'm going to be using a blend that's very famous, Barat. It's, I think, 7 spices. And there's a variation that I think has more Moroccan variation that is like 11 or something. But then there's another spice actually that I uncovered when I was doing my research that I'd never heard of called fenugreek.
Fenugreek.
Yeah, fenugreek.
I wasn't familiar with that one. So I'm going to be making my Jerusalem mixed grill with those.
So fenugreek is an interesting spice. It's used in health food. I want to say it helps with fertility. I'm not positive.
I'm staying away from it. My favorite spice blend is Ras El Hanout. It smells wonderful and tastes wonderful, and I believe it's from Morocco.
So traveling to Morocco is a fascinating trip. I led a trip there literally just before the pandemic. We arrived back in the US on March 10th, and the lockdown started March 13th. I've never zipped through an airport as fast as I did getting out of JFK on March 10th. From the time the plane hit the ground, landed, until we had gone through customs and had our bags.
Wow.
Literally out the door was under an hour.
So maybe the next trip will be Israel and Morocco.
All around food and spices.
It's an interesting combination. And there's a lot going for it because you end up picking up all of these different cultural elements. And if you stop and talk to a spice merchant, you'll get a story that'll knock your socks off. And it almost doesn't matter which merchant you go to. They've all got those stories.
When we were in Istanbul, I think we learned more from the spice merchants than we did from touring the city.
Yeah, they've got stories to tell.
Well, and everyone definitely needs to come back next week because Ori tells these stories in English without hardly an accent. So you'll be able to hear them. He has an absolutely fabulous story about paprika in Hungary. So everyone needs to come. His family is originally from Hungary. And so he's got this really interesting, look at the paprika that they have done.
The spicy Hungarian paprika, yeah.
Right, and there are multiple kinds of Hungarian paprika.
Well, there's spicy and the sweet paprika and
Smoky. I like the smoky paprika.
And gradations between them. There's like a little sweet or a lot sweet or a little spicy or a lot spicy. I remember learning that the hard way at a restaurant in Budapest. And the markets though in Budapest sell all these varieties of paprika. And so if you want to bring back paprika for a friend, at least I remember bringing some back for the office staff, and I didn't know what the hell kind I was buying for them. And I just smiled and said, "Good luck with it. Tell me how it is."
so I'm thinking a series of international dinners that we can make even at the temple. If we don't have the restaurants in town, we could certainly
For
make
sure.
international dinners.
But
Right.
you would have to come home, Carol.
We're
2
home.
weeks, be home in 2 weeks.
You're still in Florida. Wow.
The trick is finding enough people like Hanita who know their way around spices to be able to teach it. She knows it very well, and it's a skill and it's an art. And I fiddle around in the kitchen, but I haven't figured out spice blends yet.
I've tasted her blends. They're fabulous.
Yeah. All right. So what I'll do is I'll send the links to the story about this book and to the other article that Tina Wasserman wrote, and the information on the book, so you can look at this stuff yourself. And if you want, I'll send you the link to the Old Bay story too, just because it's a fun story. But the next time you're cooking in the kitchen, start blending things, see where you get, and take a shot at it, because I think what you'll find is the blend starts to tell a story by itself. And that's one of the things that I learned in reading all of this, is that while there are all these factors of history and geography and economics and culture and agriculture, all of it comes through the more you start blending things and mixing things together. And so that becomes the challenge, is how do we pull all of these different elements together?
Jen, I can't imagine you'd be scared by anything.
And Pat, yes, I will make sure whatever recipes Hanita gives out, I send out to you as well.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Mhm.
Mara, what else can I do?
That's, if nobody has any other questions, would like to thank Rabbi Fellman for going and reading that whole book and sharing his wisdom with us. We, like I said, next week, the guy from Burlap and Barrel will be here. Please spread the word, because they have decided that they should create a spice company that is similar to coffee or chocolate, where you get a relationship with a farmer and you develop that relationship, and you And you only buy, like McCormick will buy paprika from 20 different suppliers. Burlap and Barrel only get it from one supplier and develop a relationship with them. So if you're interested in agriculture or sustainability, in addition to spices and cooking, he's going to be a really fascinating person to listen to. So please spread the word for more people to come hear him. And thank you, Rabbi Fellman, and thank you all for coming.